Welcome, everybody, to the Distorian's Lounge. My name is Kate, aka the Disney Cicerone, and I am absent my usual co-host, Kirk from Walrus Carp, just because he has some other obligations tonight. So we're going to talk about Disneyland's Chinatown, which is such an obscure topic that most people have never heard of it. And we're also going to go kind of a deep dive into the context behind Chinatown, why they were going to develop it, and also do a little bit of talking about the animatronic that was before Mr. Lincoln, but not the Tiki Room Birds, and also a park that you've probably never heard of before that actually you can't really find anywhere on the internet. So this is very, very obscure history tonight. So thank you for being with me as we talk about some of these really unique things in Disneyland that not many people know about. So we're going to start out before we go to Disneyland. I think it's really important that we understand the broader context of what was happening in the world around Walt Disney when they were creating these things in Disneyland, because nothing in Disney happens in a vacuum, right? All of the things that are happening to them in their home lives and in the world, that all affects their creativity and their content and what they decided to create for Disneyland. So I want to go just back in time just a little bit to Chinatown in LA. And this is going to help us understand why there was going to be one in Disneyland. Before I dive into this, I do want to say that I want to be very, very culturally sensitive, knowing that I am not a Chinese person. I'm not of Chinese descent, and I am going to do my very best to be respectful of the history and culture of the Chinese people. If I get something wrong, it is not my intention, and I apologize, and you feel free to let me know. But it is very much for me, I want to be respectful and honor the traditions and culture of these people, even while we talk about this history. So, disclaimer, that being said, we're going to dive in to Chinatown in LA. So the first settlement of Chinese in LA in that area was in 1892. Old Chinatown was basically about 200 people on a street called the Street of the Dark-Hued Ones, which actually has a name that is worse that I'm not going to say here. It was a short alley 50 feet wide and 1 block long between El Pueblo Plaza and Old Arcadia Street. I do have a couple pictures of old Chinatown in LA to give you a little bit of context about what this looked like, but it's very much mostly men whose trade was laundry, market gardening, ranching, and road building. These men faced very, very heavy discrimination, and they also had one of the worst lynchings in U.S. history in 1871 that was directed towards this community. So even like the newspapers and whatnot, everything was extremely discriminating towards these people. So these men who lived here had a really hard time, and there wasn't women and children because because of immigration laws, they couldn't bring their wives and children over from China. The Chinese population in LA and in a lot of cities in the US held the economic market in laundry. So Chinese laundry became a thing. If you've ever heard of Chinese laundry, I think there's a brand called Chinese Laundry. That was kind of like their niche, but they did a lot of other things, and also, cooking and food. And there's things that the immigrant people from China did in the U.S. in that time. This is the market that you would see in LA's old Chinatown. I will mention also that we talked about Chinese laundry. Not only was it because it was such an important cultural thing, especially in the West, we saw it a lot in the Disney parks. So in Disneyland Paris, if you go on it's East Center Street here. I don't think it's called that there. But the street that's in the middle of Main Street that's on the right-hand side if you're walking towards the castle, if you go down that in Disneyland Paris, you will see a Chinese laundry shop, also a mahjong parlor as well. So they have Chinese laundry there, and then they at least used to have this as of 2007. This is what this picture is from. This is Chinese laundry in the Magic Kingdom in Frontierland, because a lot of the cities in the West had a lot of Chinese immigrant populations that did laundry. And then I have a quote here from Li Y Yang, who was Huntington's curator of Pacific Rim collections. He said, "Economic conditions at home in China were so much worse that even owning a small business was really striking it rich in America." So that puts it in context of we would think of some of these things like ranch hands and laundry and market, those seem kind of low on the totem pole of careers they're really respectful careers, and I think they're really important ones. But, we would kind of put them maybe like on the lower tier of things. But for the Chinese, they got paid so well, and just even having a small business, they were really able to support their families. And so that's why these men made the sacrifice to go from China to America and start these Chinese laundry things and businesses around Chinatown. So the area of Chinatown grew over the years and expanded eastward from the plaza across Alameda Street, and eventually growing to a population of about 3,000 people. And there's some old photos that have surfaced of what old Chinatown looked like. So they didn't have paved streets, so they had dirt streets then. And this is also a picture from old Chinatown. What happened to old Chinatown? Well, in 1933, because you can see the dirt roads and how it was not doing well in terms of like, it wasn't a nice place to go to. It was kind of a dirty place in terms of it wasn't being well maintained, because there just wasn't the money to do it there, because a lot of them were immigrants. And these immigrants also weren't allowed to own the land. They had to lease it because of the laws that were in there during the time. So George Eastman had a proposal to revamp Chinatown, but everybody said it was too costly, so they didn't do that. Instead, they just started demolishing it. They demolished the Chinese school, they demolished the market, and they kind of just like, everything had fallen into disrepair, so they started selling everything off, right? So this, unfortunately, forced the Chinese population to relocate. So there's a great quote from 1941, which is getting closer now to, this is when Walt Disney was living in LA, right? In 1941, Peter Suhu, who was an advocate for Chinatown, said this: "When the merchants in Old Chinatown had orders to move out and make room for the Union Terminal," which was the train station, right? "They did not know what to do. They tried very hard to find a new place, and much effort was spent seeking the proper location. They were handicapped because of lack of finances and because the uncertainty of knowing where to go. Some of them had to close their places of business." So Peter was this influential leader in Chinese community. He was fluent in Cantonese and English, which really helped him to be able to be a spokesperson for Chinatown. And then he also made periodic declarations to the local papers and that reported the demise of old Chinatown, and that it was premature, and basically saying this is such a loss that we did this. It's a tragedy that we're losing this part of our town. So he was a major advocate for that. So since the building of the Union Terminal displaced old Chinatown, a new one was then created. New Chinatown was financed entirely by Chinese people and built entirely by Chinese people, which was kind of like unheard of at the time. And they made an association that was unprecedented, that was made up entirely of the Chinese people that lived in the area. It was called the Los Angeles Chinatown Project Association, which I believe is still around today. So they created what is like a new architectural style that is Chinese American architectural style. So it blends the both, and I have some photos for you of what it looks like, which is what we kind of think of like as typical Chinatown today, right? The buildings were modern and airy and correctly engineered for earthquake, fire safety, and sanitation. So they were very cognizant of all of that, which was good, especially because in old Chinatown, there was like 2 huge devastating fires, which if you know anything about history of cities at the time, this was very common. You think of like the Great Fire of San Francisco was like devastated by a massive fire. I think Chicago had a massive fire as well. And that was just because they had wooden buildings that were built right next to each other. And if one went up, like they all went up. And that was very common at the time. They decided to make the streets of New Chinatown wider for an open and more safe look, and more palatable to the casual American tourist as well as the fellow Chinese. So the purpose was really to not only make a place for these Chinese people in LA, but also to create a place where tourists and Americans could come in and get to know their culture and get to understand them a little bit, which I love that. They also eliminated potential houses of vice, which was a big deal in old Chinatown, such as gambling and opium dens were like huge. So that's like the idea of like, you don't say to somebody, I'm going to Chinatown way back in the day. You wouldn't say I'm going to Chinatown because they'd assume you were up to no good. And they really wanted to change that perception of Chinatown as not a place of vices, but as a place of culture and food and family and liveliness, like celebration, festivals. And I think they actually did a really fabulous job of that. The organizers were true to their heritage and cultural design, and it was that harmonious blend of Chinese and American architecture by architects Earl Webster and Adrian Wilson. That was, and this is like kind of pioneering Chinatowns for then a model for other Chinatowns around the U.S. and the world. There is a gate that's Chinatown's oldest pailau, the West Gate, which looks like this. This one, the superstructure is made partially of 150-year-old camphor wood and has 4 characters of poetry across the gate, which were composed by T.K. Chang. In translation, they say, cooperate to achieve, which makes sense for this association that came together of Chinese people to create this community. And then there's also the East Gate, which is called the Broadway Gate. And this one is a gate of maternal virtues erected by Hong in honor of his mother. So the 4-character poem on it states the spirit of Mother Meng and Mother Ao. And these women were exemplary mothers in the history and culture of China. And so they were revered by their offspring. And it's basically say each Chinese child should respect their mother. So it's a very maternal one. That's the purpose of that gate. New Chinatown opened June 25th of 1938. So it's really not that new to us today. But it had much fanfare. They had bands and Chinese opera singers, firecrackers, artists, murals, which are still there in Chinatown today by Tyrus Wong. And then they gathered all the Chinese that had been displaced all around the city, and they all started moving back towards into Chinatown. Not all of them, but a lot of them did. So it gathered the community back together. They did a dedication at this opening by the ex-California governor, Frank F. Merriam, and said, New Chinatown represented a monument to those Chinese who played such an important role in building the West and lasting evidence of American-Chinese amity. And the plaque on it says, dedicated to the Chinese pioneers who participated in the constructive history of California. Because you also have to think that a lot of the Chinese also ended up working on the railroad and whatnot, which, is connected all of the West to the East and all, so very, very important. In our culture was the Chinese immigrants who came here. They didn't, they did laundry and they did work on farms and things, but they also helped build the railroad. They did a lot of things. And so I love that there's a way to honor those immigrants who really did help build parts of America. So we're going to transition into all the Disney stuff now. But I definitely wanted to give you guys a broader picture of the context in which this concept came about, because I think it's really important to understand what these Imagineers and Walt Disney, what was around them at the time? What were their influences? Where were they going in town? So 1938, Walt Disney was there. That was a year after Snow White came out. He was living in there. I don't have like a lot of evidence that he like frequented Chinatown, but it had to have been part of his world, right? I always think it's really important to give this the context when we're talking history, because just none of Disney history happens in a vacuum. And if we think of it that way, it's very limiting to our understanding of what all of this is all about and why did they make the choices they make? Why did they make the design choices they made? And, maybe why did they not make some design choices and they went another direction? All of that. And you think of it now is also true for today, the Imagineers that are making changes like Tiana's Bayou Adventure. That is a significant change that was based on some cultural shifts, right? So that has been true all throughout Disney history, that a lot of it is based on what is happening in the broader culture. So that's why we're chatting about Chinatown in LA. How does all of this translate to Disney? Well, Walt Disney was always a supporter of raising cultural awareness. If you know that about Walt Disney, he was involved with Dwight D. Eisenhower's People to People initiative, which was an exchange program to help broaden cultural understanding and promote peace during the Cold War anxiety time. Like people became very suspicious of other cultures, and also coming out of the war, they had a world war in the 1940s, which also really did not help relations with other cultures, from America to other cultures. So this was an idea of like, let's get to know other cultures and like have our children do exchange programs so that they grow up in an era where they understand, they have a broader understanding of other cultures rather than just a suspicion and fear, right? So there was a couple of things that Walt Disney did. He had a lot of parades that involved other cultures. This is from the Christmas in Many Lands parade This one specifically is from recording from 1962. But you can see that a local cultural group from China, and they had this float, these little kids on this float and this is a little kid who's feeding a dragon something. It's really hard to tell what it is, even in the video. They had a local cultural group who had their traditional dress that they made. These are all volunteers. This is not somebody Disney paid, and it was not cast members like they are today. It was just local volunteer groups that would volunteer and come and walk in the parade and show their culture with a float that they made so that people could get a little bit of understanding about who they were. Sometimes the volunteers didn't always show up. So there's that. So eventually they stopped doing that, I think mostly because it was a little bit, it wasn't dependable, and they went another direction where they're like, we're just going to fully control this thing now. But I still love the idea that Disney did that for a really long time, because it was really important to Walt Disney that people understood other cultures, which is also why they plan to have International Street next to Main Street USA. Now, International Street is an entire Distorian's Lounge all on its own. It is a lot. It is a lot of information, and it is the precursor to what we now know as Epcot's World Showcase, right? That's where the idea came from. I'm pretty sure that this is a sketch of Disneyland before they had that first aerial view that Herb Ryman did, that Walt Disney kind of sat with him over the weekend and gave him milkshakes. I think he wanted chocolate milkshakes in order to do it in a short period of time. So this is more of a hand-drawn sketch of what Disneyland was going to look like. I think one of my favorite parts is where it says Root Beer Garden right there near the hub. So instead of the Carnation Plaza Gardens, it says Root Beer Garden, which is just really fun. They also have Recreation Land over there as well, which kind of moved outside of the park later, and Land of Tomorrow instead of Tomorrowland. They also have Holiday Park, which kind of became Holiday Hill when they took all the dirt from the castle and they threw it up to the side there, because they dug out the moat and the foundation for the castle, and then they put it in a big hill, and it was there. That's now where the Matterhorn is. That's where it was for a long time. They do have Fantasyland back there, and then the Painted Desert, and they do have, of course, the Rivers of America over here, but it's not labeled. So then you can see all the parking and all the things, and they have a close-up view of Main Street USA. You can see this is the close-up of Main Street USA, and you can say the words that are there next to that arrow say Two-Way International Street. So this is, you can see Main Street is right there, and then Two-Way International Street. And so that side street that you see that now goes to the lockers would have actually connected with the Two-Way International Street. So I have a theory about the brick test wall that is there that everybody talks about all the time, that there is a wall, and it was like it looks like a window, and now it has like a water fountain in it, but it was like they said they had it in the middle of the street to show like the different kinds of bricks that they could do. And there's like the bricks are laid straight on one side and kind of crooked on another. But there's a part of me that wonders, like, was that meant to be the transition into International Street, especially in its location, because it goes to this area that you can see right next to Main Street and this one that would have been right into all of those international lands. So I don't know for sure. This is all just pure speculation for me, but I do wonder about it. So just a little aside. So the 1959 Chinatown project in Disneyland was going to be on East Center Street. So if you don't know about the streets in Disneyland, they do all have names for Main Street USA. So you can see them here. And you see there is, in the middle there is West Center Street on one side and East Center Street on the other. West Center Street's now Carnation, the Carnation restaurant. And then closer to the hub at the top, you see West Plaza Street and East Plaza Street. And then, of course, Town Square. And there was East Town Square and West Town Square down there. East Center Street is where this would have been located next to Market House, which is still there, but now is a Starbucks, but it's still labeled as Market House. So John Hench actually said, though, that it would have been a second street project, a new street potentially, and then International Street would have been built after it. So I can show you, there's not very much concept art that exists of this. And what we do have is like not great quality, but you can see that this is what Chinatown on East Center Street would have looked like. And then there's another one too that's more of kind of a very more concept arty, kind of just stylistic one that shows the different signs there's a quote from Imagineer Harriet Burns, who was the first female Imagineer that worked at WED Imagineering. Became Imagineering. It was WED Enterprises back then. She said, originally we were going to have a Chinatown, so we had all this Chinatown planned and a restaurant. Always a restaurant. So a restaurant was there from the very beginning. So Walt Disney said, I want to have a Chinese restaurant in the park. So this restaurant would have had windows on the inside that had projections in the windows to make it look like you were in China when you looked out the window at like a busy China street, which I think is really interesting. And that's why I always wonder, did he go to Chinatown and like be eating and look out the window and see people going by and get that feel? I just really curious as to that, if that was inspired by that. But how amazing would it be to be in a restaurant that has like projections in the window, kind of like Space 220, I guess, is like the closest thing we have to that now. But it's like have something in the window that makes you feel like you're in a whole different place, right? How amazing would that be? The windows would have had those projections, and then they would have served fine Chinese cuisine, which was defined as your dinner was a choice of almond, duck, shrimp, chicken, or beef entrees, and then followed by a dessert of Chinese pastries. And because this was never actually opened as a restaurant, I don't have menus. I don't have like any more information than that. But that was definitely that. Seating for the restaurant was every hour on the hour. And they had a meditation room, which I think was like a waiting room / bar, from what I understand. There's not that much information out there about this. So some of this is like, this is all I've heard. And they also had a gift shop. And something that was really interesting that they had up on the wall was a golden dragon, or possibly a pair of golden dragons. And this is where we have to go back to Chinatown in LA, because they do have these 2 golden dragons that are up there. But these ones were going to be some of the very first audio animatronics. But the Golden Dragon Parade in LA, in Chinatown, is a Lunar New Year tradition that started in Old Chinatown in the late 1800s. So this idea of the golden dragon bringing luck, right, that's where it comes directly from Chinatown. So these golden dragons would start what was going to be a dinner show, but the dragons would talk to you and start the show. And it sounds very much like the Tiki Room birds talking to you, to the audience. And it was voiced by Wally Bogue, who is also the voice of the Tiki Room birds. So he would say things like, honorable patrons look very happy, must have been something you ate. Again, I'm going to just throw out there that not a lot of this is culturally sensitive. Remember, this was the 1950s, and some of it was just downright not good. So I'm going to try to be as respectful as possible, but I am trying to report history. So just take that for what it is. So another thing the dragons would say is they would look around the room and then they would like belch fire and smoke. And then they'd say, hope no one in the audience minds if the dragon smokes. And then they would say, oh, I think someone I ate disagreed with me. Of course, that's probably why I ate him in the first place, for disagreeing with me. So these are very much like Tiki Room jokes, right? These are the ones that we're used to from this era of Disney. That's because the dinner show was written by Wally Bogue, who co-wrote the Golden Horseshoe Review, if you are familiar with that show. The show itself starred a wise philosopher who was originally going to be Confucius, who we will talk about in just a second. A ride in Disneyland with a name we can't even say on social media anymore. Yes, it's true. It's true, Lem. There's a couple things of Disney's past that I have to I either have to give a disclaimer or we have to skip it. But I usually try to just give a disclaimer because it's history. And I don't believe in kind of like washing out history, the bad parts of history. I think it's important that we talk about them so that we can learn and be better. And I think it's really important that we don't just like forget that this stuff happened. I think it's really important that we discuss it and look at it under the microscope and be like, oh gosh, that maybe isn't something we should do anymore, you know? But does it make it palatable? No, like it's uncomfortable. And sometimes it's really hard to sit in that. And sometimes it's really hard to report on it. And it's extremely hard as a historian because people will make assumptions about what you're saying. And I was like, I am just reporting the facts and the history as it was written. And I don't want to change it just to make us more comfortable. I think it's important that we have that discomfort with things that happened so that we don't do it again, so that we're better. All right. So the dinner show in this Chinese restaurant that was written by Wally Bogue starred a wise philosopher who was originally going to be Confucius. So let's just take a little tiny mini sidetrack to talk about Confucius. And I do have some very old art that stars Confucius here. He was a sage Chinese philosopher of the spring and autumn period from 551 to 479 BC. His name was Latinized from a form of the Mandarin Chinese Kongfuzi, I think is how you say that. And the Jesuit missionaries to China coined his name Confucius. So that's where the name comes from. Confucius was, I want to just say, shout out to my husband, Elliot, who he teaches philosophy on the college level. So, and he heard I was talking about Confucius. He's like, I've got things for you. And he ran and he grabbed me a book and he's just telling me all the things. And he was so excited because apparently during the, when the world was shut down, he did a deep dive into Eastern philosophy. So he's like, let me tell you all the things. I was like, this is more information than I need for this podcast. But I love my husband dearly. So I'm going to share with you just a little bit of what he shared with me. He said that Confucius was basically reacting to the warring states period in China, and they were having a civil war, and so he was reacting against that. His teachings and philosophy was basically very pivotal to Eastern Asian culture and society, and is still very influential in China and East Asia today. He has philosophical teachings. Elliot was very careful to say it's not a religion, it's a philosophy. Some people treat it like a religion, but it's a philosophy, and it's called Confucianism, which emphasizes personal and governmental morality, correctness of social relationships, justice, kindness, sincerity, and a ruler's duty to their subjects. Eliot says that the filial piety is the showing love and respect for your parents, your brother, sister, your elders, and your ancestors is kind of what it bases it on. So I thought something was really interesting about Confucius, and Confucius is extremely important in this story of Chinatown, and you'll see why in a minute. But this is where we get the golden rule. So if you've ever heard of the idea of do unto others as you would have them do unto you, that comes from Confucius. He didn't exactly say it that way. The direct quote from it is there any one word that could guide a person throughout life? And Confucius said, how about reciprocity? Never impose on others what you would not choose for yourself. So it was really interesting doing a little bit of research into Confucius. I went down the Confucius rabbit hole. So here we are. Because a lot of quotes are misattributed to Confucius. People have just come up with quippy things that they think are cute. And then they just assigned it to Confucius. Now, here on Distory, we always go for primary source documents, right? We don't just take the third hand whatever is on the internet and use it as fact. So, of course, we go back to the primary source documents for Confucius, and I did find a couple of things that he said to give you a concept of what Confucius actually said. One is, learn as if you could not reach your object, and were always fearing also lest you should lose it. That's from the Analects by Confucius. He also said, fine words and an insinuating appearance are seldom associated with virtue. And this one's also, this one felt relevant to me because I am turning 40 in a number of days. So this one says, when a man at 40 is the object of dislike, he will always continue what he is. And I was just oh no, that just means you're done at 40 if you're not a good person. I don't know if I agree with that, but it's an interesting concept. So those are things that actually did come directly from Confucius. And I really want to make sure that so now I found a few that are attributed to Confucius, but I'm not entirely sure they are either, because I just didn't have time to fully connect it. But I just want to give you an idea of some of the things that are out there that people assign to Confucius. So this total little delineating line. So this one says, it does not matter how slowly you go, so long as you do not stop. which I really love that sentiment. And I'm on board with that sentiment. It just might not be Confucius. Another one is, our greatest glory is not in never falling, but in rising every time we fall. Also a great sentiment. Life is really simple, but we insist on making it complicated. I think I could agree with that. And then, wheresoever you go, go with all your heart. Which that one kind of is like, could have pulled from certain places of it, but that's definitely not a direct translation of anything that he said from the research that I've done. But it's a really nice sentiment, so I'm just going to share it with you guys anyway. But let's go back to Disneyland's Chinatown, and we're inside the restaurant. So they had this figure that's kind of like Confucius. He was going to be an animatronic figure. He had other names for this figure as like through development of it. One is Chew Well, since it wasn't a restaurant, so they were going to name him Chew Well. I'm just going to reiterate that these are just history. This is not me like confirming that this is a great name for this character. And later Grandfather Chung, which was the hope that the Chun King Chinese food might sponsor this location, which it never did. But it was Chun, Chun, not Chung, because Wally Bogue just added a G to it and thought that was A-okay. So I do have I found a super old commercial that is for Chun King Chinese food. And it's very much like Americanized version of Chinese, which is very interesting. So it has this guy with a chow mein box for Chun King, and then all these people that are very excited to try the noodles that are in the Chun King chow mein. That's how the culture at large was viewing Chinese culture at the time. So it gives us a little bit of context as well. So Grandfather Chung was kind of like the last name that they kind of settled on for this character that was running this dinner show in this Chinese restaurant in Disneyland. So Grandfather Chung would have started the show saying, "Now that you have dined on food, it's time to dine on knowledge." They took questions from the audience, and I'm going to use that in air quotes, audience, because it was actually just a pre-recorded voice that was going to come from the back of the room that would shout out questions, and then he would answer. So we've heard now the real Confucius sayings. Here's the Disney ones, and just brace yourself. Just brace yourself, okay? The first one's not bad. What is a budget? A budget is a great invention that allows you to live within by going without. And that's fair. Okay, that's great. I can get on board with budgeting, especially in the new year. Sounds great. Then this one is, a young girl complained that her father said she talked too much. Yeah, I gotta take a moment for this one. Every young girl should be the picture of her mother, but not the soundtrack. And then there was, psychology books very handy, if applied right, suggest 3 brisk strokes over head of child. So, yeah, it aged like milk. Agreed. It is, yeah, that's just a small sampling of what was in the 1950s. What I would say, white people who wrote a show about Asian culture decided to do. So probably for the best that one didn't actually end up getting built, right? I do kind of like the end of the show, though. The end of the show ended in kind of more of a sentimental note. And it said, "True words are not flowery, and flowery words are not true. And as for peace, just having everyone in the world practice universal love toward each other would bring the world peace and good order. If a man does not do what is good, it is not the fault of the basic good of which man is constituted." So it does end up with this message of kind of like world peace, global understanding, which ties right back into Walt Disney, right? It kind of leads the way also for It's a Small World and the UNICEF ride that they made in the 1960s for the 1964 World's Fair. So you can see pieces of all of this that then later got integrated into other parts of Disney culture, which I think is why it's so important for us to understand what happened here in Chinatown, even if some of it is maybe not so palatable to our current cultural sensitivity feelings. So there was also other things on stage with grandfather Chung. One was he was surrounded by singing mechanical nightingales in cages, which we'll get to birds in cages in just a minute. But this was a reference to the story The Emperor's Nightingale by Hans Christian Andersen. So that's where that comes from. And then they would use the technology that Imagineers learned from Birds in a Cage, which we'll talk about in a moment. They also would have had a group of female singers that they called the Nightingirls. So there was that. Wally Bogue did do a stereotypical Chinese accent for the character of Grandfather Chung. He recorded some sample tracks for Chung and the Dragons, because he did both. Walt liked his work so much that it was one of the reasons he got Bogue involved in writing and performing for the Enchanted Tiki Room. So that is why Wally Bogue is involved with the Tiki Room. A quote from Wally Bogue is, "We worked on this concept for months, but there was some technical difficulties we couldn't overcome with the dragon. However, everyone liked the birds we had in the show, so the dinner show with a comic dragon became a dinner show with enchanted birds. The concept evolved into the Enchanted Tiki Room." So that's where we get, among other things, there's other kind of influences for the Tiki Room, and we've talked about that on Distory before. But this heavily influenced a lot of the elements in the Tiki Room came from this Chinese restaurant that was never built in Disneyland. Yeah, so let's go back to Confucius for a minute and talk more specifically about Disney's Confucius. Because out in the lobby, there would have been an old Chinese fellow like Confucius, not an actor, but a figure made out of plastic. Now, the customers will ask him questions, and he'll reply with words of wisdom. This is all Walt Disney saying this. We'll have an operator in the back of the figure answering the questions and making his lips move. So it was kind of like an animatronic, but also not fully an animatronic, because it would have had somebody behind him kind of making his lips move. But then they kind of transitioned it to more of an animatronic. Anyway, it was early animatronic. So this was the animatronic between Buddy Epson Little Man project. If you are in Hollywood Studios now, you can go visit this actual Little Man project. They have the video of it, and they have the actual little figure that they were trying to figure out how to make him move using like a series of gears. So this was very, very early, before they developed the magnetic tape technology that came from the Polaris submarine. It was like declassified NASA technology is what ended up making audio animatronics possible, because it's all magnetic impulses on magnetic tape. That's how audio animatronic works. So they didn't have that technology yet. So they were trying to find other ways to do it. So they had the animatronic Little Man project, and then they had Mr. Lincoln. So if you guys are familiar with Great Moments with Mr. Lincoln, is the exhibit that was in the 1964 New York World's Fair that Disney created for the state of Illinois. And it is now still in a variation of it in Disneyland. You can go and see in the Opera House that's on the right-hand side in Disneyland, which, by the way, is where that used to be the like mill for Disneyland, was that building. And then they converted it to a show building later. But Mr. Lincoln was like considered the first like human animatronic for Disney, but he actually wasn't, because there was one that Disney made between the Little Man project and Mr. Lincoln. And that's what we're going to talk about. So a lot of you probably already know that when Walt went to New Orleans in 1946, he discovered an antique mechanical bird in a gilded cage. And now this one does hang in Walt Disney's office now. So if you go on a tour of his office, you can see it in the corner right there, hanging up there. The archives has preserved it, and it still works from what I've heard. I've never actually seen it operational, but it does work. Harriet Burns said, "It's amazing that you can get such an interesting movement from a very simple mechanism." And Walt said, they've done this in Europe for hundreds of years. If they had done this well, we can do things much better. So he gave this bird to Roger Broggie to take it apart and kind of figure out how it worked. Knowing that they're working on the bird here, Walt is thinking about this Confucius figure. And he's like, how do we make this talk? So he told the Imagineers to watch television with the sound on, to look at people's mouths and see how they form words, and then try to translate that into Confucius and into their model of that. And Waffle Rogers, remember that when people were working on the project, talked to others, they never looked each other in the eye. they always were staring at their mouths because they started like studying how mouths move to try to make it accurate to this figure. Charles Cristodoro, the sculptor, modeled some human heads, and then they experimented with cams, hydraulics, and other methods to make the figure move kind of like the bird did that was in the cage. John Gladish in the Disney Studio Machine Shop started to fiddle around with the talking head, and he worked on his in his spare time. This is all by author Todd James Pierce. I want to make sure I credit him all these words here. So he worked on this in his spare time using springs to control the mouth and acquired prosthetic eyes that he fit under brass eyelids. Once he developed rudimentary eye and mouth movement, he asked members of the model shop to create a latex skin to cover the mechanics, but the skin never fit around the eyes with the material pinched at the corners. After multiple latex masks were created, the team in the machine shop decided it was better to embrace the design flaw, explaining that the mechanical head was modeled on a man of Chinese descent, as that would explain why the skin narrowed sharply to points around the eye sockets. So the long and short of this, if that didn't make any sense to you, was they were designing a head that looked like them. They needed someone who was more of like Chinese descent, of someone who was more of like authentic from that region of the world. They ran into that, and then once they figured that out, they kind of made it work. Now, I actually do have a photo, and I credit the Disney History Institute for this one. This is the only photo I have ever seen of this Confucius model, but we do have a photo of it. So you can see he's next to Mr. Lincoln here, and that is the Confucius audio animatronic head. This is obviously after they put Mr. Lincoln together, so he was probably canceled by this time. A very interesting picture, and he looks very real. Like, I think they did a really good job. I mean, not real, but for the very first audio animatronic human, like, they did a pretty good job. This experimental head was shown to guests who visited the studio. His head would sit on the table, and he would unexpectedly spring to life and talk. So he would kind of like freak people out that way, including Ken Anderson, who was shocked and puzzled when it came to life. The figure had that black cap and big glasses, and would smile. His eyes would move and blink, and his lips would move. This is when Harriet Burns was on the project. She said, "That's when we started on the human audio animatronic figures. We had a Chinese head, and I had a bucket of latex under my desk. And I would dip him in the latex for a new skin whenever he peeled. It took about a month where he'd deteriorate so badly, and so I redid him." So whenever Confucius' skin started to peel off, she dunked his head in the bucket under her desk. So the problem was the skin kept deteriorating at a pretty rapid rate, and they were frustrated with it. So Disney hired Bart Thompson, who was a chemist at MGM, and he invented a new synthetic compound to make a more pliable and durable skin for the robotic figures. And that was later incorporated, that technology was incorporated for President Lincoln. So that technology was critical to making, you think of all of the audio animatronics we know and love, like in Pirates of the Caribbean and whatnot, that technology came from this project. Then basically all of the knowledge from creating that head was incorporated into Abraham Lincoln, and then everything else that came after that for human audio animatronics. So this was like pivotal in Disney history. So Harriet Burns made this really elaborate model, which I have never seen. I've never seen a picture of it. If anybody out there ever finds a picture of the Chinatown model, I'm pretty sure it was destroyed, as I've never seen a photo of it. But she made this really beautiful model of Chinatown, which was also sometimes called the China Arcade. She said, "It was wonderful. I worked on models for the street for weeks. So I had all this wonderful little filigree on the Chinatown model to show Walt when he came in on a Monday morning. He came in and didn't even look at it. He said, 'We're not going to do Chinatown. San Francisco and Los Angeles already have Chinatowns. There's no need for one at Disneyland.' So the project was shelved, and they did incorporate the technology for President Lincoln and Enchanted Tiki Room. They moved it on to that. So that was it. That was it. Walt said, 'No, we're not doing this.' But we did, yes, we do get some Disney China things and a couple other aspects. You know, we do have a China area of Small World, and we do have it also now in the World Showcase in Epcot. So in the end, we do end up getting some elements from this further down the line in different ways. Like there is, if you think of in Small World, there is that big China Gate, just like in Chinatown in LA. And of course, based off of traditional architecture in China. But so we do get a few of the concepts kind of live on, but International Street and Chinatown never happened. They were just canceled as projects. So here's where we come to a really fascinating part of this story, because I had someone who contacted me a couple of weeks ago, maybe a couple of months by this point, and her name is Caitlin Bryant. And shout out to Caitlin out there. Thank you so much for reaching out to me, because this was probably the highlight of my 2023 was learning all about this. She said, hey, I have this thing hanging up in my office that belonged to my great uncle, Richard Lane Tom. And it's a print that looks like it's labeled the Orient. And she said the history of her family, they said that he presented this to Walt Disney as like a land or a park, and that he turned it down or something. She's like, she didn't know that much about it. She's like, can you tell me about this? And I was like, at this point, I'd known all about Chinatown. I'd known about Confucius. I'd known about Disney's history with this, but I had never seen anything like this. And so I did a lot of research trying to figure this out. It's labeled 1964, and I'll show it to you guys in just a moment. But it was just really interesting because I was like, I don't know what this is. So I reached out to our good friend Kevin Lively, former Imagineer Kevin Lively, and I said, have you ever seen anything about this? And he was able to find a very small blurb about her great uncle in this document online. And this is the only place I have seen any information about this park. So this was the Orient theme park from 1964. And the information about it is it was designed by Tom and Truskier, and they designed a recreation commercial project on a 40-acre site near Disneyland that was known as the Orient. The development, conceived in 1964 and never realized, was to be an Oriental in architecture and operated mainly by Oriental merchants. Now I have to pause here and say that Caitlin said that her family was all of her ancestors and whatnot. They were the ones that designed Chinatown or operated Chinatown. They have a very long history in Chinatown, so she is very heavily involved in that to some degree. So I think that's really amazing that, like, if you remember the association of LA's Chinatown that we talked about and how it was so unprecedented that they would have, it was all run by Chinese people. And so to have that then be a theme park that was going to be in LA that would be all operated by Chinese merchants and people, how amazing would that have been? So visitors would then enter the Orient through a gate in a 25-foot high Great Wall of China. So here's where I'm going to show you. These are not like the world's best pictures. I'm hoping to meet up with Caitlin at some point and get some better photos for you guys. But here is there's a gate that you get into the parking lot down here of the Orient. You can see the sign down at the bottom says the Orient is in that white circle that's down there. And then if you can see kind of like the main gate area, there's this big wall that goes all the way around that is supposed to symbolize the Great Wall of China. It says attractions will range from magic carpet rides over a yellow sea to sales rooms and exhibits of export-import firms. And then it says a rendering of the proposed project evokes a traditional Chinese watercolor. So that's what you see here, is it looks very much like a traditional Chinese watercolor. And to my knowledge, I don't even think photos of this exist on the internet. Like, I literally only have this one video that she sent me. So you can kind of see, this is what it looks. It says the Orient. She does give a little tour. I'm just muting it for you guys. But this is in Anaheim, California. And she points out Tom and Truskier. So she points out her great uncle down here, who are the architects for the project. And then it shows us the rest of the park. There's the main gate and then the sign that shows the Orient is right here. And then you can see that Great Wall of China and the What I'm guessing is the Yellow Sea is probably the water there. And they have a pagoda, which they do have in Chinatown now, and all these buildings, and then some outbuildings in the back. So this is this proposed 40-acre site near Disneyland that was going to be called the Orient. So her great uncle, Tom, has quite of an interesting history. He was responsible for design of a number of public buildings in LA, a whole bunch of fire stations, a civic center. He basically did a lot of architecture in this area. And he also co-designed the flagship Bank of America building in the Chinatown district of downtown Los Angeles, which I think is where Caitlin's connection comes in there. Richard Tom grew up in Chinatown and was living with his mother and maternal grandparents in a small apartment. And then the interesting part was Tom was a child actor, which I guess is LA, so yeah. Performing under the stage name Lane Tom Jr. And he was starring most recognizably in the Charlie Chan series, playing 3 different sons. And he also appeared in several movies, including Lady of the Tropics with Hedy Lamarr, which I had to look up because I've never seen Lady of the Tropics. It's not a Disney movie. So this was... he was in this movie. That's not him, but he was in this movie. So not only did he design this... Oriental theme park that could have been in LA, but he also was in several movies. So just amazing history there that was fascinating to me. So Chinatown in LA influenced the Chinatown in Disneyland, and Disneyland's Chinatown then influenced the audio animatronics that are everywhere in Disneyland and the Enchanted Tiki Room, not only in the birds in the cages, right, that were going to be on the stage in Chinatown, but also the ones that were going to be the ones that are singing and whatnot. And the idea of Wally Bogue voicing them and writing the story, that came from Chinatown. And then also the windows of it, that you would look out and you would be transported to somewhere else because of the projections in the windows that were going to be in that Chinese restaurant. So there is so much history that's tied up in this project that didn't ever actually happen. Not to mention Confucius, which is a whole other thing, right? So really just fascinating history. And then we also have the Chinese laundry. The Chinese laundry that was, at least at one point, was in Frontierland and Magic Kingdom, which might still be there. I'm going to take a look when I go soon. And is also in Disneyland Paris with the Mahjong parlor and the Chinese laundry there as well. All tied back into this history of Chinatown in the West and the Chinese immigrants. And it's amazing how something so obscure could have so much of a ripple effect on all of Disney history. So very, very interesting. Thank you, everybody, for joining me for this episode of Distorian's Lounge. I hope that you enjoyed hearing some really obscure stories from Disneyland's history, including all of Chinatown and how that impacted Disney culture and Disney for the Imagineers and some of their designs going forward. And also, I hope you enjoyed hearing about the Orient theme park that is so rare that I don't think many people even know that ever existed, or almost existed, I should say. But thank you for being with me and hanging out and listening to the obscure Disney history with me, with a dash of encouragement here and there. I really do appreciate you guys hanging with us. And next week for Distory, we will be back with a new series, and Kirk will hopefully be with me then, and we'll do Distory with Kate and Kirk as normal. But until then, I'll see you next time.